Hi, everyone. The Cultural Insights interview was extremely eye-opening for me. I was able to interview my brother-in-law, Tim. He is Taiwanese. His parents immigrated to the US 35 years ago, so he grew up in a traditional Taiwanese household in New Jersey. And I had never gotten this in depth with him as I did during this interview about his culture, about the foods he eats. So it was just a really great way to get to know him a little bit better and to connect with him about something that is obviously a huge part of his life. So I started off the interview and I included various questions, but first I asked him what some everyday or staple foods are in Taiwanese households. He told me that beef noodle soup made with a variety of spices, as well as braised pork rice, are Taiwanese meals that are eaten on a regular basis. He also emphasized just how important rice is in Taiwanese households, which I'll get into a little bit later. In addition to everyday foods, I inquired about celebratory foods that might be eaten on holidays, at weddings, or on special occasions. He told me that zongzi, or stick rice dumplings, is typically eaten on the holidays. And he added that while there are variations of that dish across Asia, that in Taiwan, it's usually a pyramid shaped kind of meal. So after I learned a bit more about the typical cuisine, I asked him what he wishes health professionals knew about his culture in order to better communicate with him about food and nutrition. And as I mentioned earlier, he emphasized how important rice is in Taiwanese households and in Asian households in general. And he told me that he wished that various health professionals could understand that rice is not bad for you. Instead, rice is a huge cultural phenomenon that brings together families and allows them to sit together around the table. He expressed that he wished that health professionals wouldn't demonize foods and that they would rather find a solution to work around those sort of cultural staple foods. Going off of that question, I asked him if he thought that there were any health conditions that his culture is more predisposed to because of typical foods that they eat. Again, he touched on the rice aspect and how big of a part of a diet that rice really is in Taiwanese households. And he said that while some health professionals might think that eating a lot of rice might lead to obesity, that the obesity rates in Taiwan are only at 6% versus the US, where they're much higher. And he thinks that it doesn't really have anything to do with the typical diet, since we see noodles and rice in American diets as well as Taiwanese diets. He thinks it has more to do with the lifestyle. And in addition to that, he doesn't know of any sort of conditions that his culture is more predisposed to just based on the foods that they eat. And finally, I asked him if he had ever felt discriminated against in a healthcare setting because of his culture, to which he responded no, and rather that because of his culture, he feels that he's more aware and sensitive of others from different cultures. So, after I finished the interview, I did a lot of reflection and realized just how beneficial this experience was as I continue building my career in nutrition and dietetics. It's so important to recognize any personal biases you might not even know that you have during interviews like these. And before I spoke with Tim, I would have never considered just how crucial of a role rice plays in Asian families and in Asian meals. It completely makes sense. But when counseling someone on nutrition, I think it's really important to consider which foods need to be respected. It's really easy to tell someone to just cut something out of their diet, but you kind of need to consider just how much tradition can be held in certain foods for certain cultures. Additionally, I find it extremely important to be aware of your client's actual heritage. So, in the case of Tim, my brother in law, he's Taiwanese. So, when I asked him if he would be open to doing this interview, I made a point to say that I was going to be interviewing him about typical Taiwanese culture, not Asian culture. I think that it is extremely offensive to group smaller cultures like Taiwanese into their larger subgroups like Asian, because you didn't really feel like spending the time to find out what country someone is actually from. Additionally, depending on what country in Asia, or any sort of continent, I guess, you're from, your diet might look completely different from someone in a different Asian country. So, this is something to be cognizant of, especially as a person providing nutrition counseling from a completely different culture. One more thing that I think is very important to be aware of is how different cultures communicate. It might be drastically different than how you communicate or how your culture communicates. For example, I used to work with people who lived in the Philippines, and in their culture, they're very indirect, they're very quiet, which is not what I'm used to. In the US, with like the culture of Americans who are usually very direct, very loud. And while neither culture is right or better, it's important to know your audience, know your setting, especially as a healthcare provider. And you want to sort of match that communication style of whoever you are providing nutrition counseling to. And for nutrition professionals specifically, I think that one of the most important things to consider is just how much of a meaning certain foods can have to certain families, which I really saw in this interview with Tim, how much weight rice holds in his family, in Taiwanese families, and Asian families. And while I don't think that demonizing food is a good method of nutrition counseling in any setting, cultural staples like rice in the Taiwanese culture should never be demonized. They should be respected. And instead, a more collaborative approach should be used. For example, if I were giving nutrition counseling to Tim, I might ask what his typical diet looks like. And if it sounds like he is eating a lot of white rice during the day every day, I might suggest subbing whole grain or brown rice for the white rice. And if the white rice is non negotiable in his household, I might try adding in extra veggies throughout the day or replacing the rice with quinoa a few nights a week. Completely cutting out foods usually isn't a good idea, especially when they hold cultural significance. So, this interview overall was a great experience. On a personal level, I got to connect with my brother in law about his culture, and on a professional level, I was able to consider cultural differences and biases that I never thought I had before.